Picture a ship, 400 meters long, 200,000 tons of steel, containers, and cargo. Now picture it stuck, sideways, in a canal that's barely wider than the ship itself. That's exactly what happened in March 2021, when the container ship Ever Given wedged itself across the Suez Canal. For 6 days, nearly nothing moved. Not oil, not electronics, and critically, not food. By the time it was over, ships carrying an estimated $10 billion of trade were backed up on either side for every single day of the blockage. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. The Suez Canal is just one of 14 places on Earth where the entire global food system narrows down to a single fragile pinch point. 14 locations, canals, straits, ports, and inland transport corridors that the majority of the world's traded grain, soy, and fertilizer must pass through to reach the people who need it. Squeeze any one of them hard enough, and you're not just delaying a shipment, you're threatening the food security of entire nations. This is the story of the 14 choke points that quietly feed the world, and what happens when one of them closes. Let's start with the basic idea, because it's more surprising than it sounds. We tend to imagine global food trade as something diffuse, thousands of farms, thousands of ships, thousands of routes all spread out across the planet like a giant redundant web. If one path breaks, surely cargo just reroutes somewhere else. That's mostly true until it isn't. Global trade researchers at Chatham House, the London-based Policy Institute, spent years mapping exactly how the world's grain and fertilizer actually move, not in theory but in practice, ship by ship, port by port. What they found was that global food trade doesn't look like an open web at all. It looks more like an hourglass, wide at the top, wide at the bottom, but pinched almost to nothing in the middle. That research identified 14 choke points that are critical to global food security, a mix of maritime straits and canals, coastal ports, and inland transport corridors. And here's the number that should stop you. More than half of all international grain trade passes through at least one of these 14 points. More than 10% of that trade depends on a maritime choke point that has no viable alternative route at all. No detour, no plan B. If it closes, the grain simply doesn't move. Of the 14, 8 are maritime, the canals and straits that ships must physically pass through. 3 are coastal ports, and 3 are inland corridors, the roads, railways, and river systems that carry crops from farm to port before a ship ever enters the picture. And despite carrying the literal food supply of billions of people, these places have almost been invisible in how we think about food security. Physical choke points are critical to global food security, yet the risks of their closure or disruption have been largely overlooked, treated as a footnote instead of the central vulnerability they actually are. We obsess over crop yields, drought, and fertilizer prices. We rarely ask, what if the ship carrying that fertilizer simply can't get through? So who are these 14 critical junctures? Let's walk the map. The maritime giants are the names you'd expect if you follow shipping news. The Panama Canal, slicing through Central America, cutting weeks off voyages between the Pacific and Atlantic. The Strait of Malacca, squeezed between Malaysia and Indonesia, one of the busiest shipping lanes on the planet. The Suez Canal, connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, and from there to Asia. The Turkish Straits, the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, threading the Black Sea out towards the rest of the world. The Strait of Gibraltar, the Strait of Dover, each one a bottleneck of water that an enormous share of the planet's food must pass through. The key maritime choke points include the Panama Canal, the Strait of Gibraltar, the Turkish Straits, the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca, and the Strait of Dover. Some of these matter more for specific crops than others. Roughly a quarter of all global soybean exports pass through the Strait of Malacca alone, largely feeding livestock demand across China and Southeast Asia. And the Turkish Straits carry an outsized share of the world's wheat. Around a fifth of all global wheat exports pass through them, most of it flowing out of the Black Sea breadbasket region. Then there are the coastal choke points, the ports themselves, where crops first meet the sea. Key coastal choke points include the Black Sea ports, the U.S. Gulf Coast ports, and Brazil's southern ports. These are the loading docks of the planet's breadbaskets. And finally, the inland choke points, the parts of the system most people never think about at all. Key inland choke points include the United States inland waterways and rail networks, Brazil's inland road network, and the Black Sea region's rail network. Before a single grain of wheat or soybean reaches a port, it has to travel, often for hundreds or thousands of miles, down a river, along a railway, or on a single overburdened highway. Together, the choke points running through the U.S., Brazil, and the Black Sea account for 53% of the world's total crop exports. 3 regions, a handful of physical routes, more than half the planet's traded food. This is what makes the whole picture so unsettling. We think of food security as a question of farming, about rainfall and soil and how much wheat or soy the world manages to grow each year.
But increasingly, it's a question of logistics, whether one bridge holds, whether one canal stays open, whether one railway keeps running. So what actually threatens a choke point? The honest answer is almost everything. The causes of disruption range from the mundane, a railway track warping under extreme heat, to the extreme, like a deliberate attack on critical infrastructure. In between those two extremes sits a long list of very real, very ordinary threats. Droughts that drop river levels too low for cargo ships, storms that shut down ports for days, labor strikes, political conflict, aging infrastructure that simply hasn't been maintained. And this isn't hypothetical risk we're talking about. It's already happening, repeatedly. Of the 14 choke points considered systemically important, all but one, the Strait of Gibraltar, have experienced at least one disruption to transit within the past 15 years, with incidents ranging from a few hours to over a month in length. 13 out of 14, already disrupted, not once, but repeatedly over just the last decade and a half. Some of these disruptions barely make the news, a brief closure here, a rerouted convoy there, but some become global events. The ever-given grounding in the Suez Canal in 2021 is the one most people remember. Roughly 19,000 vessels passed through that canal in the year before the blockage, and the 6 days it sat wedged across the channel are estimated to have held up around $9.6 billion in trade for every single day it blocked passage. But the Suez blockage is really just the most visible example of a much deeper structural fragility. Even small, localized disruptions can cascade through global supply chains and across entire sectors when they happen at locations that carry strategic importance for the flow of global trade. A minor problem in the wrong place doesn't stay minor. It ripples outward into shipping schedules, into commodity prices, into the cost of bread on a shelf thousands of miles away. And the pressure on these routes isn't static, it's building. Continued growth in exports out of the Black Sea region is expected to increase reliance on the Turkish Straits, especially for wheat, while sustained demand growth in China, which has averaged around 14% annual growth in soybean imports over the past decade and a half, will keep increasing shipments through the Panama Canal and the Strait of Malacca. In other words, the world isn't spreading its risk out over time. It's concentrating more and more trade through the exact same narrow doors. Here's the question that matters most. When a choke point closes, who actually feels it? The uncomfortable answer is that the pain is never distributed evenly. Food security in low-income countries, particularly across the Middle East, North Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa, increasingly depends on trade, and the backbone of that trade is this same global web of choke point-dependent transport routes. These are countries that, in many cases, grow only a fraction of the grain they consume. They rely on imports arriving through ports and straits they have no control over, and often no alternative to. When the Turkish Straits slow down, wheat importing nations across North Africa and the Middle East don't have a backup wheat supply sitting in reserve. When the Panama Canal or the Strait of Malacca gets congested, the ripple isn't abstract. It shows up as higher prices at markets that were already stretched thin. This is the part of the story that turns a shipping delay into a humanitarian issue. A blocked canal in Egypt can raise bread prices in a country thousands of miles away that had nothing to do with the disruption and no way to prevent it. And yet, for decades, this entire category of risk has been treated as an afterthought. Current assessments of food security have typically focused on conditions at the household or national level, things like income and local production, with import dependence treated mainly as a source of price risk rather than an outright physical supply disruption. Meanwhile, data on how grain and fertilizer actually move along these routes and analysis of how systemically important these choke points really are have both been largely absent. Compare that to how the world treats energy security. Oil choke points, the Strait of Hormuz for example, get intense, constant scrutiny. Analysts track them daily, governments plan around them. Food choke points, despite arguably being just as vital to human survival, have received nowhere near that same level of attention, a striking contrast given how central choke point risk has long been to how the world thinks about energy security. We built early warning systems for the oil the world burns. We built almost nothing equivalent for the wheat the world eats. So, is anyone fixing this? Slowly, yes, but the response has lagged far behind the risk. Researchers point to several priorities: investing in the physical infrastructure of the most fragile inland and coastal routes, many of which are aging and undermaintained, particularly across the US, Brazil, and the Black Sea regions. Building better real-time data and monitoring so that disruptions can be spotted and responded to before they cascade, and encouraging countries to diversify where they source critical food and fertilizer imports from, so that a single point of failure doesn't become a national crisis. The events of the past several years have made the case louder than any report could. The Suez blockage in 2021 showed how a single grounded ship could hold billions of dollars of global trade hostage for a week. The war in Ukraine showed how a conflict near the Black Sea coast could threaten the wheat supply of entire regions almost overnight, since so much of the world's grain funnels through that single corridor of ports and straits. These aren't abstract policy papers anymore. They're previews. Here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. We like to imagine that global food security is mostly a story about farming, about rainfall and soil and how much wheat or soy the world manages to grow each year. But growing the food wasn't never the hard part. Moving it is. And right now, more than half of that movement depends on just 14 physical places on Earth. A canal here, a strait there, a stretch of railway that if it buckles in the heat can slow the flow of grain to an entire region. 13 of those 14 choke points have already been disrupted at least once in the past 15 years. Not hypothetically, actually. And as demand keeps climbing in Asia and exports keep growing out of the Black Sea, the traffic through these same narrow corridors isn't decreasing, it's intensifying. So the next time a headline mentions a blocked canal, a drought-shrunk river, or a port closed by conflict, it's worth remembering that's not just a shipping story, it's a food story. And for a growing share of the planet, it's a story about whether dinner arrived at all. If this changed how you think about the food on your plate, that's exactly the point. Most of us never see the system until it breaks. Subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden infrastructure holding the world together, and drop a comment. Which choke point surprised you the most? Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one, because the next disruption isn't the matter of if, it's when.